The deed was for 40 acres of dust and bitterbrush, and it was all Lin Su-yin had left of her husband. That and the 5 daughters who stood behind her, their dark eyes wide as they stared at the raw, sun-bleached town of Redemption Creek, Nevada. The year was 1872, and the air tasted of alkali and broken promises. Su-yin clutched the paper in her hand, the official stamp of the Territorial Land Office a small, hard square against her palm. Her husband, Wei, had worked himself into the grave laying track for the Central Pacific, and this claim, purchased with the last of his meager wages, was meant to be their anchor in a hostile new world. Now it felt more like a tombstone. Her daughters huddled together, a small flock of black-haired birds. Anne, the eldest at 12, held tight to 6-year-old Finn's hand, her face a mask of premature responsibility. Between them were Bao, Chen, and Dai, their silk traveling clothes, once a mark of respect for their journey, now coated in the fine pale dust of the trail. They were a stark island of color and silence in the boisterous, grimy street. Men in sweat-stained hats paused to stare, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The women who peered from behind curtains in the clapboard houses were no kinder. Su-yin felt their judgment like a physical weight. A Chinese widow with 5 mouths to feed and no man to speak for her was not a pioneer. She was a problem. The wagon master who had brought them from Reno had already unceremoniously dumped their few trunks by the side of the dusty track that served as a main street. He'd taken her last silver dollar and pointed a thick finger towards the distant shimmering hills. "Your claim's out that way. About 3 miles. Can't miss the surveyor's stake. Good luck to you, ma'am." He hadn't meant it. His tone made it clear he thought she'd be dead or destitute within a week. Therefore she had to act before despair could take root in her children's hearts. She squared her shoulders, the unfamiliar weight of being the sole authority a heavy yoke. "Anne, Bao," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We will find water first. Stay with your sisters." Before she could take a step, a man blocked her path. He was large and well-dressed for such a place, with a waistcoat of dark wool despite the oppressive summer heat, and a watch chain gleaming against his belly. His smile was wide but did not reach his eyes. "Well now, what have we here?" he boomed, his voice carrying across the street. Several onlookers stopped to listen. "Lost, little lady?" Su-yin met his gaze directly. "I am not lost. I am looking for the claim of Wei Jin." The man chuckled, a thick, unpleasant sound. "Wei Jin? Ah, the railroad man. I heard he met his maker out on the grade." "A shame." He gestured vaguely at the deed in her hand. "I am Marcus Thorne. I own the freight company here, and a fair bit of the land besides. I knew Wei. In fact, he owed me a small sum. But I'm a charitable man." He lowered his voice, making a show of confidentiality that was meant for everyone to hear. "That plot of his is worthless. No water, soil's no good for anything but lizards. Tell you what, I'll give you $20 for the deed. A kindness, you understand. Enough to get you and your little ones on the next wagon back to California where you belong." $20. The paper in her hand had cost Wei $200, every cent he had saved. It was an insult wrapped in the guise of charity. The crowd watched, waiting. They saw a helpless woman, a foreigner, being offered a lifeline by the town's most important man. They expected gratitude. They expected her to bow her head and accept. Su-yin's grip on the deed tightened. She thought of Wei's hands, calloused and cracked from the blasting powder and the steel rails. She thought of his promise of a home, a place where their daughters would not be servants. Giving up the deed would be like burying him a second time. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The land is ours." A ripple of surprise went through the onlookers. Marcus Thorne's smile tightened. "I believe you misunderstand. That wasn't a negotiation. It's the only offer you're likely to get. There's nothing for you here." "We will see," Su-yin replied. She gathered her daughters, pulling them close, and with as much dignity as she could muster, she began to walk towards the edge of town, towards the arid hills and the single surveyor's stake that marked their future. She did not look back, but she could feel the eyes of the entire town on her. She also felt another gaze, a quieter, more assessing one. From the deep shade of the general store's porch, a man leaned against a post, unmoving. He was lean and weathered, his hat pulled low. The only thing notable about him was the worn leather of the gun belt at his hip, and the stillness in his posture. He watched her go, his expression unreadable, and he was the only one in Redemption Creek who did not look away when she passed. The 3-mile walk felt like 100. The sun beat down, and the trunks, which they had to drag and push, grew heavier with every step. Fen began to cry from thirst and exhaustion, and Su-yin's own hope, so fierce in the face of Marcus Thorne's condescension, began to fray. When they finally saw the wooden stake with Wei's name carved crudely into it, the sight brought no relief. The land was exactly as Thorne had described it, a slope of parched earth dotted with sagebrush and rocks. There was no shelter, no sign of water, nothing but the vast, indifferent blue of the sky above and the baked ground below. Su-yin sank to her knees, the dust rising around her in a fine cloud. The girls huddled around her, their silence more damning than any accusation. She had brought them to the end of the world. But she was their mother, and a mother's despair is a luxury she cannot afford. She took a deep breath, forcing the arid air into her lungs. "We will make a shelter first," she declared, her voice rough. "An, you and Bao will gather the largest branches of this brush. Chen, Dai, you will find flat stones. Fen, you will stay with me." They worked through the afternoon, a grim, silent team. They managed to construct a crude lean-to against a rocky outcrop, using their travel blankets for a roof. It offered little protection from the sun and would offer none from the cold of the desert night. Their water was nearly gone, shared out in tiny, measured sips. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red, a horseman approached. It was not Marcus Thorne. This man was younger, leaner, and rode with a slouching disinterest that did not match the expensive cut of his clothes. He reined in his horse a few yards from their pathetic camp and looked down at them with open disdain. "My employer, Mr. Thorne, sent me," he said, not bothering to dismount. "He is concerned for your safety. This is his grazing land, you see. He worries about vagrants, especially ones who might start fires." Su-yin rose to her feet. "This is not his land. We have the deed." The man laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A piece of paper from some clerk in Carson City? Mr. Thorne's cattle have watered in this territory for 10 years. His claim is one of use. You're trespassing." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "He's giving you until morning to be gone. For your own good." He glanced meaningfully at the 5 girls who had frozen at the sound of his voice. The threat was clear. Su-yin's heart pounded against her ribs. This was not about land. It was about power. Marcus Thorne could not abide her defiance. "We are not leaving," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's a foolish choice." He started to dismount, his hand dropping to the heavy whip coiled at his saddle. "Maybe you need a more direct explanation." Suddenly another voice cut through the tense air, calm and low. "I believe the lady understood you the first time." They all turned. Standing not 20 feet away was the man from the general store porch. He had approached on foot, his steps making no sound on the dry ground. He wasn't looking at Thorne's man. He was looking at the ground as if contemplating a particular patch of dust. His hands were loose at his sides. Thorne's man stiffened, his hand falling away from the whip. "This ain't your concern, Caleb." "Isn't it?" The man named Caleb finally lifted his head. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a weariness that seemed older than the rest of him. "Last I heard, this was a federal claim, legally filed. Threatening a homesteader is a territorial offense." He took a slow step forward. "And I'm sure Mr. Thorne wouldn't want any trouble with the marshal, would he? Bad for business." The hired man's face flushed with anger, but also with a flicker of something else. Fear. He looked from Caleb's calm face to the worn Colt at his hip and seemed to make a calculation. He spat on the ground. "Thorne won't forget this," he snarled, but the threat was aimed at Caleb, not Suyin. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the cooling air. Suyin stared at her rescuer, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. He was not a lawman. He was just a man. But his name, his presence, had been enough. Caleb walked over to their meager camp. He didn't look at their shelter or their empty water cask. Instead, he scanned the landscape, his gaze lingering on a faint line of darker green vegetation 100 yards down the slope. "Your husband picked this spot for a reason," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He pointed. "See those willows? Water runs under willows. Not deep, but it runs." He walked to their collection of trunks, picked up the small spade Way had packed for gardening, and started walking toward the trees. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for thanks. Suyin watched him for a moment, then turned to her daughters. "Bring the buckets," she said, a flicker of something she hadn't felt since Way's death stirring in her chest. It was not hope, not yet, but it was the possibility of it. From a ridge overlooking the valley, Marcus Thorne lowered his spyglass. He had seen the entire exchange. He watched his own brother dig in the dirt for a foreign woman and her brood. His face, usually a mask of affable control, settled into a cold, hard line. The land didn't matter. The woman didn't matter. This was about Caleb. And for his brother, Marcus Thorne had no charity at all. He knew Caleb's secret, the one thing that could ruin him completely. It was time to use it. By the time the sun had fully set, the hole Caleb dug was deep and blessedly damp at the bottom. The water seeped in slowly, muddy at first, but then clearing. It was not a river, but it was life. Caleb helped them line the small well with some of the flat stones the girls had collected, creating a stable edge. Suyin worked beside him, her initial apprehension replaced by a quiet focus. She noted the economy of his movements, the way he worked without wasted effort. He was strong, but it was a lean, wiry strength, not the brute force of Thorne's other men. When the well was finished, she took one of their few porcelain cups, dipped it into the precious water, and offered it to him. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. He drank slowly, his eyes on the horizon. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He just nodded, handing the cup back. He looked at the lean-to, then at the 5 small faces peering at him from the shadows. "You'll need more than a blanket for a roof. The nights get cold." "We will manage," Suyin said, a hint of her earlier pride returning. He didn't argue. He simply looked at her, a long, searching look. "Marcus is my brother," he said, the words dropping into the quiet like stones. "My older brother." Suyin froze. The man who had protected her was brother to the man who wanted to destroy her. The world, which had briefly seemed to have a moment of clarity, tilted back into confusion. It made no sense. "He doesn't like being told no," Caleb continued, his voice flat. "Especially not in public. This isn't about your land anymore. It's about him showing this town that what he wants, he gets. He'll use the law if he can. If not, he'll use other means." "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question blunt. He was silent for a long time, staring into the deepening twilight. "Our father built the freight company. He was a hard man, but fair. When he died, he left it to both of us. Marcus, he had papers drawn up. Said I was a drunk, unreliable. Said I signed my half away for a few $100s. I never saw the money, and I never signed that paper." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a history of loss that mirrored her own. "I've seen him do this before. Squeeze people. Break them. Take what's theirs with a smile and a piece of paper that looks like the law. I just got tired of watching." That night, for the first time in a long time, Suyin felt a sliver of peace. Caleb's confession had not made her situation less dangerous, but it had made her feel less alone. He left them with a quiet "ma'am" and disappeared into the darkness, but the well he had dug was proof he had been there. The next 2 days passed in a fever of labor. Suyin and the girls, fueled by the water from their new well, worked to improve their camp. They dug out a small dugout shelter in the side of the hill, a place that would be cooler during the day and warmer at night. They were clearing a patch of ground for a garden when the second rider came. This one wore a tarnished star on his vest. He was the territorial deputy, a man with a drooping mustache and shifty eyes that never quite met hers. He held a folded document in his hand. "Mrs. Jin?" he asked, his voice oily. "I am she," Suyin answered, standing between him and her daughters. "Got an official notice for you." He unfolded the paper. "It seems there's an outstanding lien against this claim. A debt of $100 owed to the Thorne Freight Company for supplies delivered to your late husband." He paused for effect. "The debt is past due. Mr. Thorne has filed for seizure of the property as payment. You have 48 hours to pay the sum in full at my office in town. Otherwise, you'll be evicted for non-payment." Suyin's blood ran cold. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. Wei had been obsessively frugal, paying for everything in cash. He would never have taken supplies on credit. "My husband had no debts," she stated, her voice trembling with rage. The deputy shrugged, a picture of bureaucratic indifference. "The paperwork says otherwise. Got his name right on the ledger. It's all legal and binding." He tipped his hat. 48 hours, ma'am. The law is the law." He rode off without a backward glance. $100. He might as well have asked for the moon. She had less than $5 to her name. This was Marcus Thorne's other means. The law, twisted into a weapon. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She could not fight the law. She could not fight a man who could buy the law. She looked at her daughters, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. Perhaps Thorne was right. Perhaps the only answer was to run. But where would they run to? Back to the crowded, hostile streets of San Francisco? To a life of servitude and scorn? Here, on this dusty patch of nothing, she had a deed. She had a well. It wasn't a home, but it was a beginning. To leave now would be to admit defeat, not just to Marcus Thorne, but to the memory of her husband. Her eldest, Anne, came to her side. "We are not leaving, Mama," she said, her child's voice filled with an adult's resolve. "This is our place." Looking at her daughter's determined face, Suyin made a choice. It was a choice born not of hope, but of the refusal to surrender. She would not run. She would fight. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. That evening, as she sat staring into the fire, contemplating the impossible, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Caleb. He carried a small parcel wrapped in cloth. He set it down without a word. It was a fresh loaf of bread and a slab of bacon. "The deputy paid you a visit," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, too weary to speak. "It's a lie," he said. "The ledger is a fake. It's his way." "I have 48 hours," she whispered. "I have no money." "He expects you to run," Caleb said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "That's what most people do. It's easier for him that way. No fuss." "I am not running," Su-Yin said, the words gaining strength as she spoke them aloud. "I will go to the county seat, to Carson City. I will speak to the land registrar, to the marshal. I will show them my deed." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of something like admiration warmed his tired eyes. "Carson City is a 2-day ride. The registrar won't see you without an appointment. The marshal won't listen to a woman like you without a man to speak for. And Marcus has friends there." Every word was a nail in the coffin of her plan, but she would not be deterred. "Then I will wait. I will speak to anyone who will listen." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "My brother made a mistake," he said softly. "He thinks you're alone." He looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers in the firelight. "I'll ride with you to Carson. I know the registrar, and I know a few things about my brother's ledgers that the marshal might find interesting." 4 months later, the wind that swept down from the Sierras carried the crisp promise of winter, but on Su-Yin's homestead there was warmth. The crude dugout was gone, replaced by a small, sturdy sod house, its chimney puffing a steady stream of smoke. A root cellar was dug into the hillside, filled with potatoes, carrots, and squash from the garden that had flourished by the well. The 40 acres of dust and bitterbrush were still mostly dust and bitterbrush, but near the house there was an island of order and life. In town, Su-Yin stood behind a small stall in the makeshift market near the livery. She was selling her surplus vegetables, neatly bundled. The same people who had stared at her with suspicion that first day now greeted her with a nod. Some even called her by name. "Morning, Mrs. Jin. Those carrots look fine today." Her daughters were with her, helping to weigh produce and make change, their English growing more confident each week. They were no longer a problem. They were part of the town. The trip to Carson City had been the turning point. Caleb had been true to his word. He knew the registrar, a man who owed his position to Caleb and Marcus's father. When presented with Su-Yin's pristine deed and Caleb's testimony about his brother's long history of fraudulent liens and forged documents, the official had launched a formal inquiry. The territorial marshal, initially dismissive, became very interested when Caleb described specific instances of freight records being altered, a federal offense. Marcus Thorne's power had been built on a foundation of intimidation and the illusion of legal authority. When that foundation cracked, his empire began to crumble. Word of the investigation spread through the territory. Men he had cheated for years suddenly found their courage. Faced with multiple lawsuits and federal scrutiny, Thorne's grip on Redemption Creek slipped. He was no longer the town patriarch. He was a common swindler, and his fair-weather friends vanished like morning mist. Caleb was not at the market. He was out at the homestead, mending a fence for the small corral that now housed 2 goats and a mule. The gun belt he had worn so constantly was gone, replaced by the comfortable weight of a hammer. He worked the land with Su-Yin, their partnership forged not in words, but in the shared labor of building a life from nothing. He was quiet and steady, and his presence was a comfort that went deeper than gratitude. That evening, as the autumn light faded, Su-Yin sat with Anne at the small wooden table inside their new home. The air was warm from the cook stove, smelling of baking bread. Spread before them on the table was the deed. Su Yin's finger traced the English words as she sounded them out for her daughter. "Homestead," she said. "It means home." Anne repeated the word, her brow furrowed in concentration. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching them. He had been cleaning a harness, and the smell of leather and oil clung to him. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the small room. Su Yin looked up from the paper, and her eyes met his. In that shared glance, a world of understanding passed between them. There were no promises of forever, no grand declarations of love. There was something quieter and perhaps stronger, a shared survival, a mutual respect earned through hardship. There was the solid floor beneath their feet and the sturdy roof over their heads. Su Yin gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. He turned and went back to his work, the comfortable sounds of his movements a part of the house's evening rhythm. Su Yin looked back at the deed, at the official stamps and the flowing script. Wei had bought her a piece of land. But a home was different. A home wasn't just a piece of land claimed with paper and ink. It was a place defended by courage and built day by day with hands that refused to let go. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.